Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be filling you in on everything I read this January. So, over the past month, I've read a total of 7 books, and in terms of genre, I read a handful of horror, of course, but I also read a romance novel, some nonfiction, one memoir, and one about film theory. I'll start with nonfiction since I don't rate those books, and then I'll talk about each fiction book in order of my favorites from the month, starting with my least favorite and ending with my most favorite. First up in nonfiction, All Boys Aren't Blue is a memoir by journalist and LGBTQIA activist George Matthew Johnson that traces his life from childhood through his college years, focusing on experiences growing up as a black queer boy. This is a deeply personal and vulnerable book, and one that feels very intentional about who it's written for. I think the memoir clearly has a specific audience in mind: young queer boys, young black boys, especially those who exist at the intersection of both identities, as well as young teens who want to be better allies. Within that context, this book feels incredibly valuable. Johnson offers representation, and he does so with honesty and openness. His writing invites readers to feel seen rather than lectured, which I think is the book's greatest strengths. That said, I also think All Boys Aren't Blue has value beyond its intended audience. The book takes on topics like toxic masculinity, male friendships, gender expression, and emotional vulnerability, and this is valuable for boys and men more broadly, particularly in how Johnson examines the pressures placed on young boys to perform masculinity and suppress softness, fear, or difference. This is not always an easy read. There are moments that are genuinely difficult, emotionally heavy, and Johnson doesn't shy away from sharing painful experiences. It's not trying to shock, but to tell the truth of what growing up in this body and identity can look like. I don't think this book is necessarily saying anything radically new about race, sexuality, or gender, but I don't think that's the point. All Boys Aren't Blue is about offering hope, visibility, reassurance through lived experience. For readers who need that representation, especially at formative ages, this book could be incredibly meaningful. Next up, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in Modern Horror Film by Carol J. Clover was a really enjoyable and informative read for me as someone who obviously loves horror movies, but also loves to overthink media from an academic perspective. Originally published in 1992, this is a book that introduced the term final girl into the horror lexicon, and you can absolutely feel its influence on how horror cinema has been discussed and made ever since. This book is split into 4 essays, each examining gender in horror cinema from a slightly different angle, with a particular focus on the slasher genre. One of the more interesting observations Clover makes is about the disconnect between critics' outsiders' perspective and actual audience experience. Slashers are often dismissed as disturbing because they appear to invite pleasure in the violent killing of predominantly female victims, but Clover points out that this reading ignores the immense satisfaction the audience also takes in the climax when the final girl is cheered on in her confrontation with the killer. She also makes interesting points on how masochism and sadism might play into the viewer's experience. That said, this is a 30-year-old book about gender, and it shows. While Clover briefly acknowledges the difference between biological sex and gender, it's not meaningfully incorporated into her analysis, and some of the terminology she used would be considered transphobic by today's understandings of gender. It's imperfect, but honestly not as bad as I had expected going in. What made the book feel the most tedious for me, though, was this heavy reliance on Freudian psychology. Personally, I'm not convinced that the intent or impact in many of these films can be traced back to symbolic penises and vaginas, and those sections were a bit of a slog. Still, despite its flaws, there's a lot here to chew on, and it's the kind of book that will change how I watch horror going forward. Now let's get into my fiction reads, starting with Boys in the Valley by Philip Fracassi. This is one I possibly went into with too high of expectations for, but still found myself really enjoying despite falling short of my expectations. This was a novel I had heard a lot of buzz about and was even recommended by a couple subscribers. I think I may have gone in expecting it to completely knock me flat. While it didn't quite reach that level for me, I still found it to be a solid, overall enjoyable read, and one that absolutely has its strengths. At its core, Boys in the Valley is a coming-of-age story wrapped in religious horror. The novel follows a group of boys living in a remote Catholic orphanage during the brutal winter. where isolation, adult authority, and religious faith all begin to fracture under increasingly horrifying circumstances. There are very strong Lord of the Flies parallels here, particularly with the erosion of social order and the power dynamics between the boys. Watching innocence quickly transform into cruelty is a familiar framework because of William Golding, but one that still works when executed well. What struck me immediately is how old school this book feels despite being a modern release. Fracasse's prose is very direct and stripped down, no excess or indulgence, and I genuinely appreciated that. The writing is efficient and brutal, which pairs well with the relentless nature of the story. However, that same efficiency sometimes works against the novel, particularly when it comes to the plot. Structurally, Boys in the Valley seems somewhat formulaic, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the climax. Without spoiling anything, the resolution felt far too convenient and lacked the thematic weight I was hoping for, especially when compared to certain horror novels from the 1970s that clearly seem to have some inspiration on this book. That said, and I really do want to emphasize this, none of this means that I dislike the book. In fact, Boys in the Valley contains moments of genuine greatness. It's effectively scary in a way that I don't encounter very often. This book is brutal, gory, and action-packed almost from the very beginning, and the pacing is excellent. Once it starts moving, it rarely lets up, making it a true page-turner and honestly difficult to put down. The setting deserves special praise. The snow-covered Catholic orphanage is perfectly realized and fully utilized as a horror environment. The isolation, the cold, the rigid religious structure, all of it feeds seamlessly into the dread of the story. The snowbound setting amplifies the claustrophobia and hopelessness here in a really effective way. While some of the boys and adults fall neatly into recognizable archetypes, certain members of the cast are given surprising depth, which adds emotional weight to the violence and chaos as things spiral out of control. Overall, Boys in the Valley didn't quite live up to my high expectations I had going in, but it's still a strong and compelling horror novel. It's vicious, atmospheric, and genuinely unsettling at times. Most importantly, it made me really interested to reading more from Philip Fracasse, which is always a good sign. I ended up giving Boys in the Valley 3.5 stars. A good book that stumbles in its ending, but one that I am still really glad that I read. Next up, People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry was my third novel from the modern rom-com icon, and going into it, I felt pretty confident that I would enjoy myself, which I absolutely did. I picked this up specifically because I wanted to read it before the Netflix adaptation came out, which I also really enjoyed, and the book delivered exactly what I was hoping for, a sweet, charming, comforting romantic comedy that was easy to sink into. If I had to rank Emily Henry's books that I've read so far, this one would land at the bottom, but I want to make clear that this is not because I had any issues with it. I've enjoyed all three, and this is more of a case of personal resonance than quality. People We Meet on Vacation is fluffy in the best way, but Beach Read and Funny Story for me had a little more emotional depth that stayed with me for longer. That doesn't make this book any lesser, it just connected with me differently. The story follows Poppy and Alex, longtime friends whose annual vacations together form the backbone of the narrative. Through alternating timelines, the book slowly reveals the history of their relationship and the events that led to the emotional distance we see at the start of the novel. I really appreciated the structure, moving through the years and fragments, added tension and emotional payoff, and it kept the story engaging even when you have a pretty good sense of where all rom-coms are headed. Poppy and Alex are both wonderful characters, and their romantic and comedic chemistry is the clear highlight of the book for me. That chemistry translated beautifully on the screen as well, which didn't surprise me at all. Poppy's zaniness in particular might not work for everyone, but I personally found her charming and endearing. She brought a lot of energy to the story and balanced Alex's more reserved personality really well. Overall, People We Meet on Vacation is exactly what it sets out to be: warm, funny, romantic, and comforting. It didn't hit me in quite the same deeply personal ways as some of Emily Henry's other books, but I genuinely enjoyed my time with it from start to finish. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, which for me still reflects a very positive reading experience, and another solid win for Emily Henry. Next is One Yellow Eye by Leah Radford, which is a really strong debut novel and one of those books that feels like it was written specifically for my tastes. It came out last year, and it's a dystopian zombie novel that's also deeply emotional, grief-driven, and quietly devastating, which, if you know me at all, is my jam. I love a sad, emotional story with a horror backdrop, and this book delivered on that in a big way. The story follows Kesta, a British biologist living in London after a viral outbreak has turned part of the population into zombie-like creatures. The government is able to contain the infection, but Kesta's husband, Tim, is already infected. Rather than surrender him, she hides him in their apartment, keeping him alive, restrained, and deteriorating while she continues her work in a lab, desperately trying to develop a cure. At its heart, this is a novel about grief, love, and desperation, about what it means to love someone who is physically present but slipping further and further away. One Yellow Eye feels more like science fiction than horror. Radford goes into significant detail about biology, lab work, and scientific processes, grounding the story in a very well-researched reality. Kesta as a character in many ways reminded me to Victor Frankenstein, hyper-focused, obsessive, and willing to cross ethical boundaries in pursuit of a singular goal. The key difference, and what makes this story so compelling, is her motivations, which are that of love and grief. Her actions come from an inability to let go, and that emotional core makes all the difference. Kesta is a beautifully realized protagonist. She's deeply sympathetic, even as she behaves selfishly, recklessly, and unethically. But that felt intentional to me. Grief is messy, often self-centered, and Radford captures that truthfully. You can understand why Kesta makes the choices she does, even when you're uncomfortable with them, which makes her arc effective. While I enjoy the horror and sci-fi moments in this book, those moments don't come close to the emotional impact of its quieter scenes. The most powerful moments are the ones where Kesta interacts with what remains of her husband, feeding him, speaking to him, watching him decay, and questioning whether Tim is still present behind those yellow eyes. Those scenes are beautifully written, deeply sad, and linger. I also really love the ending. My main criticism, and one of the reasons I didn't rate this higher, is how easy it seemed for Kesta to steal from her high security workplace. Given the stakes and the setting, it strained believability more than I would have liked, but maybe that's just me. That said, I read plenty of genres, particularly horror, where suspension of disbelief is required, and this was a relatively small issue in an otherwise excellent book. Overall, One Yellow Eye is a thoughtful, emotional, and impressive debut that uses horror and science fiction to explore grief in a beautiful and heartbreaking way. I gave it 4 stars, and I'll absolutely be keeping an eye on what Leo Radford writes next. Next up is Grace by A.M. Shine. This novel released on February 10th, and I had the chance to read it early thanks to Bloomsbury USA and NetGalley, who provided me with an advanced reader copy in exchange for my honest review. A.M. Shine is an Irish horror novel, probably best known for The Watchers, which later became the film adaptation starring Dakota Fanning. I really enjoyed The Watchers, and I'm glad to say that Grace worked just as well for me. The story follows Grace, a woman who was adopted as a child and has no memory of her origins. Her life is disrupted when she receives a mysterious phone call that draws her back to a remote, forgotten island off the coast of Ireland, a place steeped in rumors of death, missing children, and something dark buried in its past. From the moment Grace arrives, the novel establishes an overwhelming sense of unease. This is the kind of book where the setting does a lot of the heavy lifting, and Shine absolutely nails it. The isolated Irish island community feels fully realized and deeply unsettling. There's a constant undercurrent of dread, especially in the first half, not necessarily driven by non-stop action, but by atmosphere. The kind that makes you feel like something is wrong even when nothing overtly horrifying has happened yet. The novel is told through multiple point of views, which is something I have mixed feelings about in short books like this. There were moments where I questioned whether every perspective was really necessary, especially given the length of the novel. That said, as a whole, the multi-point of view structure really worked for me. It created a communal sense of fear and secrecy, making the island community central to the story. I particularly loved Father O'Malley as a character, and thought his backstory was compelling. One of the biggest strengths of Grace is its incorporation of Irish folklore. Without spoiling what specific myths are used, I thought the folklore elements was handled beautifully. They felt natural within the setting, and I appreciated how the book offered its own interpretations and theories regarding the origins of these myths. I found myself pausing during and after reading to research the folklore further, which is always a good sign for me. When a book makes you curious enough to dig deeper, it's doing something right. Plot-wise, some of the twists and reveals were a bit predictable or familiar, but honestly that didn't bother me much. Grace is a fairly straightforward story, and I think it knows that. What elevates it is its prose and the atmosphere, the confidence of the writing, the sense of place, and the slow burn dread that carries you through even the more expected beats. Overall, Grace is a strong, atmospheric folk horror novel that plays into A.M. Shine's strengths as a writer. It executes its ideas with care and a real love for Irish folklore and tradition. I had a great time reading it and walked away very satisfied. I gave Grace 4 stars, and I'll absolutely be picking up whatever A.M. Shine writes next. And last, Bad Cree by Jessica Johns was easily my favorite book of the month, and a standout amongst everything I had read. This is an absolutely incredible debut novel, the kind that immediately made me excited to see what this author does next, and it left a deep emotional impression on me. The story follows Mackenzie, a young Cree woman whose life begins to unravel after a vivid dream, ending with her waking up holding a severed head of a crow. And from that moment on, the boundaries between dreams and waking life begins to blur. The nightmare continues, crows seem to watch and follow her, and she starts receiving threatening text messages from someone claiming to be her dead sister, Sabrina. Searching for answers and perhaps some grounding, Mackenzie returns to her hometown and her family. What really makes Bad Cree special is how grounded it is in family and culture. Some of the strongest moments in the book have nothing to do with overt horror, but with the relationship between the women in Mackenzie's life. Her aunts in particular was such a highlight for me, warm, funny, and deeply loving. The family dynamics felt incredibly real, and those interactions added up so much heart to the story. They also made the horror elements hit harder, because there's something genuinely at stake emotionally. I'm usually not a big fan of dream sequences in books or movies. They often feel like a narrative shortcut or a way to manufacture scares without consequence. But Bad Cree wasn't like that. Dreams are central to the story, culturally, thematically, and structurally, and the way Johns handles them is incredible. The dream sequences blur seamlessly into reality, creating a constant sense of unease where you're never quite sure what is real and what isn't. The scares within these dreams work precisely because of their unpredictability. You can't anticipate where they'll go, and that uncertainty is unsettling. This isn't a book I would necessarily describe as scary in a traditional sense, but it is deeply creepy and emotionally heavy. The tension builds slowly, relying on atmosphere rather than shock, and it's incredibly effective. The novel uses Cree mythology and the cultural significance of dreams as the backbone of the story. Through that lens, Bad Cree becomes a powerful exploration of family and grief. The title itself, Bad Cree, carries a lot of weight. On the surface, it refers to Mackenzie leaving her family and community to grieve alone after Sabrina's death. But later in the book, the idea of what it means to be a Bad Cree is explored in a much deeper way. That moment caught me off guard, and I found it genuinely moving. There is a cross-genre appeal with this too. I don't think you need to be a horror fan to appreciate this book. It's just as much literary fiction, family drama, and cultural exploration as it is a supernatural story. I gave Bad Cree 4 stars, and I really recommend it. And that's all the books that I read in January. Thank you so much for hanging out and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss my next one. But until next time, feel free to drop a comment and let me know your thoughts on any of these, or whatever books you've been loving lately. As always, happy reading everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.